Hey guys, it's Mrs. Wallace. I am just doing a quick video on the 2012 free response question. This is one of the ones in your packet, and this one is related to Monopoly. So I broke the question up into two sections, A and B on this page, and then we'll do the question and we'll put C and D on the other. So ideally, if you have already worked out this problem on your own, that would be awesome. This is going to feel a little bit like karaoke because I'm going to read it like this. I don't know if anybody's had experience, maybe not with karaoke, but Steve Rail, the only provider of train service operating between two cities, is currently incurring economic losses. So like our last question or one of the other free response questions, this is a monopolist making economic losses, so we kind of know what that's going to look like. And we know it's a monopolist because it's the only provider of train service, right? There's no doubt that this is a monopolist. The first thing we're asked to do is what we're always asked to do first when we have to draw a graph, is to label a correctly kind of demonstrated graph. We have to do the loss minimizing price and quantity, so that's going to be where MR equals MC. We can call it profit maximizing, loss minimizing, same quantity. We're also going to shade the area of economic losses, and we're going to establish the allocatively efficient quantity. So even though monopolies that are single price monopolies are not allocatively efficient, we're going to dedicate the quantity that is allocatively efficient. If Steve Rail raised the price above PM identified above, would total revenue increase, decrease, or not change? Okay, so let's imagine that we now have that Steve Rail question, and the very first thing we have to do is just kind of demonstrate here that we're going to be doing a monopoly making a loss. So we have our demand curve, we have our MR curve, and we have our marginal cost curve, and our ATC all the way up here, so that we're demonstrating a monopoly making a loss. If we wanted to demonstrate the loss minimizing quantity, we're looking at the quantity for the monopolist right there in red. We'll price all the way up to the demand curve, so expect the price to be essentially right there. And of course, this is a monopolist making a loss, so we're looking at the ATC being right there. And the difference between the ATC and the price is our per unit loss, and then we can look at the total loss by shading right here, the quantity times the per unit loss. The second part of the question is what happens if Steve Rail decides to raise the price? What happens to total revenue? And remember that if we imagine this spot right here is really key for us in terms of understanding what's going to happen to total revenue when we change the price. Everything that is in this part of the demand curve above essentially where MR is 0. So just kind of put your, kind of finger on where MR equals 0, marginal revenue is 0. That's where total revenue is at its greatest. If I kind of go straight up, I'm looking at the point on the demand curve that's unit elastic, and everything right here would be elastic, okay, including the quantity that this monopolist is producing. So if I'm producing at this quantity and I'm got this price and now I raise the price, I know that my total revenue will decrease, because if I raise the price and this is in the elastic range, as I raise that price, the quantity demanded is going to decrease, not a little, but a lot, and ultimately it's going to affect total revenue. So because it's in the elastic range, the quantities in the elastic range, we'll see a total revenue decrease. The next part of the question is pretty straightforward. We're really looking at two questions that are very, very much alike. They have to do with subsidies. Assume a per unit subsidy is provided to Steve Rail. Okay, so we should probably note a few things about this. First of all, we have a subsidy, so we know that that's going to be something that's going to affect costs. Subsidy is money that's given to the firm. They're going to apply it to their costs, and ultimately they're going to likely be in a better position as a result of the subsidy. It's kind of the opposite of a tax. And because this is a per unit subsidy, that's really the important thing in this, because ultimately, since it's a per unit subsidy, this is a firm that is going to be seeing a marginal cost shift. We have to decide, will Steve Rail's quantity increase, decrease, or not change? And we have to explain. This is actually something you don't have to graph, although we'll graph it anyway. We just have to demonstrate what will happen to the quantity and explain it. We also have to demonstrate, will consumer surplus increase, decrease, or not change? And it doesn't say explain, so honestly you don't have to. You can just say, will consumer surplus increase, decrease, or not change? So we'll look at that question first. and then we'll go back, we'll look at that question first, and we'll kind of come back and look at this. This is very similar. Instead of a per unit subsidy, in this case now we have a lump sum subsidy. The lump sum subsidy isn't going to affect marginal cost curves, and with the lump sum subsidy, we're going to be interested in what happens with deadweight loss. We're also going to be interested in what happens with Steve Rail's economic losses, okay? So if we take a look at this next slide, we'll graph this out so we can refer back to the question. Let us start here by just drawing here. Whoops, let's put on the pen. Let's draw a nice big monopoly graph. So we have our demand curve and our MR curve, okay? And we're looking at a marginal cost, okay? And we're looking at an ATC. That's going to look something like that, okay? So this is a firm making a loss. Now the key thing is with that per unit subsidy, we know that we're going to see a shift in marginal cost and we're going to see a ATC decrease, okay? So the subsidy has those two effects. Per unit subsidy is a shift in variable costs. So we're seeing marginal cost decrease, ATC decrease. If we go back to the original profit maximizing or loss minimizing quantity, it was right here, okay? And the price was right here on the demand curve. Now with the marginal cost decrease, we have a new quantity that is going to be the profit maximizing or loss minimizing quantity. It's going to be that quantity right there. And we also have a new price on the demand curve that's a little bit lower, okay? So a couple of things were asked in this question. The first thing that we're asked is, what happens to the quantity, okay? So one thing we know as a result of the per unit subsidy, the quantity is going to increase, okay? We're also asked what happens to consumer surplus, and that question is also something that is going to change as a result of the marginal cost decrease. And by the way, for that first question, when you go to explain it, the reason that you had a change in quantity is because you had a shift in marginal cost and your profit maximizing or loss minimizing quantity changed. When we look at why consumer surplus is going to change, let's kind of expand our graph here. We'll take our demand curve, all the way up there. Originally, with the first quantity, right, our price was right here on the y-axis. If we have a change in marginal costs, then we end up with the price here, okay? So this is kind of like the monopolist P2. As soon as you do that, you can see very naturally that we have an increase in consumer surplus, right? Right here, this kind of yellow square right here would be your increased consumer surplus. Before, the consumer surplus was only what was in the red, and now we have a larger consumer surplus. You're looking at, the quantity demanded that exists above this price. Where does the demand curve demonstrate kind of that good deal, right, above the said price? Let's see if we can erase this a little bit and look at what happens with the lump sum subsidy. That is a little bit easier because you don't have a shift in marginal cost, right? So the lump sum subsidy, okay, just erasing this. So this is kind of fun, actually, right? Woohoo! I don't know. Now I see why everybody's enjoying this. So let's go to our, just kind of expand our graph here. We'll erase our little, P's over here, okay, and do our graph, okay? So we've got our demand curve and our MR curve and our MC, okay, and this was loss, okay? So we have our MC, ATC, etc. And in this case, right, what happens if there's a lump sum subsidy, okay? Well, it's a much easier situation. This is kind of where the monopolist was producing. In this case, we only have an ATC decrease. We're not asked to graph it. We're just asked a couple of questions. What happens, to deadweight loss, okay? Well, what happens to deadweight loss? Nothing. There's no change at all to deadweight loss. The allocatively efficient quantity, which actually I think was one of the questions before that maybe we didn't answer, this is the allocative efficient quantity, right, where MC is equal to price. That's the quantity right here that a perfect competitor would produce. We're going to find the deadweight loss, okay, right here. Okay, I'm kind of looking at all of these transactions between the quantity that the monopoly is producing and the quantity that perfect competition is producing. These are all transactions that aren't happening, people that are not getting their quantity demanded as a result of the monopoly producing less quantity. Okay, so we have deadweight loss. When you have the decrease in the ATC as a result of the lump sum subsidy, there's no change in MC, so there's no change in deadweight loss, okay? No change. For number 2, okay, if we look at the question, I think it was the question about economic losses, in this case, you are going to have an effect. When the quantity is here for the monopolist, that is loss minimizing, this is the price that the monopolist is going to be receiving and charging. So if we note that as the monopolist price, prior to the ATC decrease, the gap between the price and the ATC at that quantity, was fairly large. When the ATC decreased, we don't know if it'll completely take out those losses, but the loss is definitely going to decrease, okay? So the loss decreases because ATC is going to be decreased as a result of the lump sum subsidy. I hope this helps, and sorry it's so messy. I will work on that, but have a good rest of the day. Okie doke.